Imagine being the most powerful person in your kingdom, yet completely helpless against the very people meant to heal you. This was the reality for many European monarchs who faced a troubling paradox. The more advanced their medical care appeared, the more likely it was to harm them. Welcome to the complex world of royal medicine, where well-intentioned physicians working with the limited knowledge of their time often caused more harm than the diseases they sought to cure. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and if you truly enjoy stories like this, consider liking and subscribing. Thanks so much. Now back to the story. In February 1685, King Charles II of England suffered what modern doctors would recognise as a stroke. His final days are extensively documented in court records and physician accounts, providing one of the clearest examples of how 17th century royal medicine operated. According to the detailed account by Dr. Raymond Crawford, published in the Oxford Medical Journal in 1909, based on original court records, Charles II received treatments that followed standard medical practice of the era. His physicians began with bloodletting, removing substantial amounts of blood, a treatment universally accepted at the time for restoring bodily balance. The documented treatments continued with blistering agents applied to his scalp, emetics to induce vomiting, and enemas containing antimony. Historical records show his physicians also administered what they called spirit of human skull and bezoar stones, remedies that were genuinely believed to have healing properties based on the medical theories of the time. Charles II died after 5 days of treatment. While historians cannot definitively determine whether his stroke or the medical interventions were the primary cause of death, this well-documented case illustrates the limitations of the 17th century medical understanding. Mercury held a central place in European medicine from the late 15th through the 18th centuries, prescribed for conditions ranging from syphilis to depression. This wasn't primitive thinking. Physicians' belief in mercury's effectiveness was grounded in sophisticated scientific theories of the era, particularly the concept that mercury's unique properties as a liquid metal could penetrate the body and neutralize various diseases through its vapor and heat. Emperor Rudolf II of Austria provides a documented case of mercury treatment effects. Court records from Prague, preserved in the Habsburg archives, describe his physicians treating him with mercury preparations throughout the 1590s for what they described as melancholic humours. Historical accounts suggest, though we cannot be entirely certain, that Rudolf's later documented symptoms of hair loss, dental problems, and increasing mental instability may have been directly related to his mercury treatments, rather than his original condition. However, it's important to note that these symptoms could also have resulted from other medical conditions common in the 16th century, making the connection between treatment and decline difficult to prove definitively. The challenge for physicians of this era was that patients sometimes did recover from their original conditions while taking mercury, which appeared to validate the treatment. They had no way of knowing that any recoveries occurred despite the mercury, not because of it. Bloodletting represented medicine's longest-held belief, rooted in the humoral theory of medicine that dominated European medical thinking for over 1,000 years. This sophisticated theoretical framework proposed that human health depended on the proper balance of 4 bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these humours became imbalanced, illness resulted, and bloodletting was seen as the logical method to restore harmony by reducing excess blood, the hot, moist humour that physicians believed caused many diseases. One of the most tragic documented cases involves Pope Innocent VIII in 1492. According to Vatican medical records, his physicians attempted what they believed was an innovative treatment: blood transfusion from healthy young donors. Contemporary accounts, including those by the historian Stefano Infessura, record that this procedure resulted in the deaths of all 4 men involved. This tragic outcome reflected the complete lack of understanding about blood compatibility and sterile procedures, rather than any malicious intent. The physicians were attempting what they genuinely believed was advanced medical treatment. King Louis XIII of France's medical treatments are extensively documented in court records. Historical accounts show he underwent more than 200 bloodletting procedures during his reign, treatments his physicians prescribed, believing they were essential for his health based on humoral theory. Modern historians suggest, though we cannot prove definitively, that this massive blood loss over decades likely contributed directly to the physical weakness and chronic fatigue that court observers documented in his later years, creating a tragic cycle where treatments for his perceived ill health actually caused the very weakness they were meant to cure. Antimony became widely prescribed in 17th century European medicine, with physicians believing it could cure fever, plague, and other serious conditions. Medical texts from this period show genuine confidence in antimony's healing properties. Historical records mention various nobles who died while receiving antimony treatments, though we must be careful not to assume direct causation. The delayed effects of antimony made it particularly difficult for physicians of the era to recognize any potential dangers, as patients might initially appear to improve before developing complications. Court records from various European palaces document cases where antimony was prescribed with the best of intentions, following established medical protocols of the time. The tragic outcomes that sometimes followed reflected the limitations of 17th century toxicology rather than deliberate harm. Bezoar stones, calcified masses from animal stomachs, were genuinely believed throughout medieval and Renaissance Europe to possess universal healing properties. Royal inventories from multiple courts show enormous investments in these stones, viewed as essential medical supplies rather than expensive placebos. Historical accounts suggest that Emperor Rudolf II maintained an extensive collection of bezoar stones, though the exact details of his collection are difficult to verify from surviving records. When illness struck, court physicians would dissolve pieces of these stones in wine, sincerely believing they were providing powerful medicine. This practice illustrates how medical knowledge of the era combined scientific observation with beliefs that we now understand were unfounded, but which were held with complete sincerity by educated physicians. Royal physicians believed that many illnesses could be cured by removing harmful substances from the body through induced vomiting and diarrhea. This approach seemed logical within their understanding of how disease worked. Court records document that Louis XIV of France received thousands of enemas during his reign, treatments his physicians prescribed because they genuinely believed these procedures were necessary for his health. While the exact number varies in different historical accounts, all sources agree that purging formed a central part of his medical care. Historical records suggest these treatments often left the Sun King weak and unable to perform his royal duties, though his doctors continued them in good faith, believing they were providing essential care. Royal physicians often combined multiple therapies, believing that comprehensive treatment offered the best chance of success. Historical records show this approach reflected their dedication to their patients' welfare, even when the results were tragic. Court documents record the death of infant princes and princesses who received multiple simultaneous treatments when they fell ill. While we cannot always determine the exact cause of death in these historical cases, the records show physicians applying every treatment available to them in desperate attempts to save their young patients. Trepanation, creating holes in the skull, was documented as a medical practice performed by educated physicians who believed they were releasing harmful pressures or substances from their patients' heads. Archaeological evidence shows this practice occurred across Europe during the medieval and Renaissance periods. Historical medical texts describe trepanation procedures performed on noble patients, though specific royal cases are sometimes difficult to verify from surviving records. What is clear from medical writings of the period is that physicians viewed this as legitimate treatment based on their era's understanding of anatomy and disease. One documented irony of royal medicine was that common people, who couldn't afford extensive medical intervention, sometimes had better survival rates than monarchs who received the most advanced care available. This pattern appears in various demographic studies of medieval and Renaissance mortality rates. Royal physicians found themselves in an impossible situation. They were expected to cure their patients using medical knowledge that was fundamentally limited, yet they couldn't admit the inadequacy of their treatments without appearing incompetent. Historical medical texts show them continuing to apply therapies they sincerely believed were correct, even when results suggested otherwise. These physicians were intelligent, educated individuals working within the scientific understanding of their time. Their failures reflect the state of medical knowledge rather than personal inadequacy or malicious intent. Historical medical texts show that some physicians began questioning traditional treatments by the 17th and 18th centuries, as they observed repeated failures of established protocols. This gradual shift toward evidence-based observation represents the slow evolution from medieval to modern medical thinking, Court records from later periods show increasing documentation of treatment outcomes and growing skepticism about some traditional remedies. This change came slowly, as physicians had to balance new observations against centuries of accepted medical doctrine. The next chapter examines well-documented cases of monarchs who faced long-term illnesses, exploring how medieval and early modern medicine attempted to manage chronic conditions that couldn't be quickly resolved. We'll look at verified historical cases where royal patients and their physicians worked together over years or decades, facing medical challenges that the limitations of their era made nearly impossible to overcome. These documented struggles reveal much about both the courage of individuals facing serious illness and the dedication of physicians working with the limited tools available to them during these historical periods. Ruling a kingdom while battling chronic illness presented challenges that are well documented in court records across European history. Unlike common people who could retreat from public life during illness, monarchs had to maintain their royal duties even as their health declined over months or years, creating situations that are extensively recorded in historical archives. This chapter examines verified cases of European rulers who dealt with long-term medical conditions, the documented limitations of historical medicine in treating chronic diseases, and the remarkable strength many of these individuals demonstrated while facing their health challenges under public scrutiny. Henry VIII's transformation from athletic young monarch to physically impaired ruler is one of the most thoroughly documented medical cases in royal history. Court records, diplomatic correspondence, and contemporary accounts provide extensive evidence of his declining health following a jousting accident in January 1536. The wound on Henry's left thigh, documented in letters from court physicians and foreign ambassadors, developed into what modern medical historians believe was chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that 16th century medicine could not effectively treat. Dr. G.C. Dunlop's 1970 analysis of surviving medical records suggests the wound never properly healed, leading to decades of complications. Contemporary accounts describe Henry's physicians trying various treatment, including honey applications, herbal poultices, and regular wound cleaning. Court records show these treatments followed established medical protocols of the Tudor era, though they provided only temporary relief. Historical evidence strongly suggests that Henry's chronic pain may have contributed to personality changes documented by court observers. Foreign ambassadors' reports from the 1540s describe a marked change in the king's temperament, though we cannot definitively prove a direct medical causation. What makes Henry's case particularly well documented is how his condition affected court protocol. Venetian diplomatic reports describe modifications to royal ceremonies to accommodate his declining mobility, and Spanish correspondence notes how his physical limitations influenced international negotiations. Medieval and Renaissance physicians documented numerous cases of what they described as internal consumption or wasting diseases, conditions that modern medical historians believe may have been various forms of cancer. Emperor Frederick III of the Holy Roman Empire's final illness in 1493 is documented in imperial court records preserved in Vienna. These sources describe a 2-year battle with what physicians called internal corruption, characterized by difficulty eating, persistent pain, and gradual physical decline. The medical approaches tried by Frederick's physicians are recorded in court documents, showing treatments based on humoral theory, the dominant medical framework of the 15th century. While we cannot verify the effectiveness of these treatments, the records show genuine efforts to help their patient using the best medical knowledge available. Court chroniclers documented how Frederick continued fulfilling royal duties despite his illness, though contemporary accounts suggest, without definitive proof, that his condition may have affected his ability to govern effectively during his final months. Syphilis appeared in European medical records during the late 15th century, creating unprecedented challenges for physicians who had to develop treatments for a completely new disease. The condition's progression through distinct stages over many years is well documented in medical texts of the period. King Francis I of France's medical history, preserved in royal archives, includes references to treatments that historians believe may have been related to syphilis, though the exact nature of his condition remains debated among scholars. Court records show he received mercury treatments, the standard therapy for what physicians called the French disease, during the 1530s and 1540s. The challenge in studying historical syphilis cases is that contemporary physicians often used euphemistic language in their records making definitive diagnosis difficult centuries later. What is clear from surviving documents is that mercury treatment was widely prescribed, and that patients often suffered severe side effects that physicians of the era did not connect to the treatment itself. Court observers documented changes in Francis I's health over his final years, though we must be cautious about drawing direct connections between these observations and specific medical conditions without more definitive evidence. Queen Anne of England's health problems are extensively documented in court records and contemporary medical accounts. Her physician's notes, preserved in the Royal College of Physicians archives, describe symptoms that modern medical historians believe suggest diabetes, though this condition was not understood in the early 18th century. Dr. John Radcliffe, Anne's primary physician, documented her excessive thirst, frequent urination, and other symptoms in medical records that survived in royal archives. His treatment approaches, recorded in detail, included dietary modifications that historians note bear some similarity to modern diabetic dietary principles, though his reasoning was based on 18th century humoral theory. The political implications of Anne's health are documented in parliamentary records, where her physicians provided assessments of her condition that influenced succession planning. These medical reports had to balance honesty about her health with political sensitivity about royal succession. Contemporary accounts describe Anne's declining health during her final years, though historians must be careful not to retroactively diagnose historical figures with modern medical precision when original records lack the detail needed for certainty. Kidney stone disease created some of the most thoroughly documented cases of chronic royal illness, as the dramatic nature of stone attacks made them impossible to hide from court observers. Louis XIV of France's kidney stone episodes are extensively recorded in court documents, diplomatic correspondence, and the detailed journals kept by his physician, Dr. Antoine de Caen. These records provide one of the most complete pictures of how chronic illness affected royal governance in the 17th century. The medical treatments tried for Louis XIV are documented in court records, showing approaches that included dietary modifications, increased fluid intake, and various herbal remedies. While we cannot assess the medical effectiveness of these treatments by modern standards, the records show systematic attempts to manage his condition. Court protocols had to be modified to accommodate the unpredictable nature of stone attacks, with these adaptations documented in palace administrative records. Foreign ambassadors' reports describe how Louis XIV's condition affected diplomatic meetings and state functions. Gout affected multiple generations of the Habsburg family, creating one of the best documented cases of hereditary illness in royal history. Court records and medical texts provide extensive evidence of how this condition impacted royal governance across several reigns. Emperor Charles V's gout is documented in imperial correspondence, with letters describing how the condition progressively limited his mobility. Court records show modifications made to imperial ceremonies and the development of specialized furniture to accommodate his condition. The hereditary nature of Habsburg gout is evident in court records describing similar symptoms in Charles V's son, Philip II of Spain. Medical historians have traced this genetic pattern through multiple generations using surviving court documents and contemporary medical accounts. Treatment approaches for royal gout are documented in medical texts of the period, showing systematic attempts to manage the condition through dietary modifications, topical treatments, and various medications available to 16th century physicians. Tuberculosis and other respiratory conditions are documented in numerous royal medical cases, with court records providing detailed accounts of how these diseases progressed and how physicians attempted treatment. King Louis XIII of France's respiratory problems are recorded in court medical documents and contemporary observations by courtiers. While modern historians cannot definitively diagnose his condition centuries later, the documented symptoms and progression suggest what we now recognize as tuberculosis. The treatments tried for Louis XIII are recorded in royal medical archives, showing systematic attempts to address his breathing difficulties through environmental changes, dietary modifications, and various herbal preparations. These approaches reflected the best medical understanding available in early 17th century France. Court records document how Louis XIII's condition affected royal governance, with state functions modified to accommodate his health limitations and governmental procedures adapted to ensure continuity during his periods of severe illness. King George III of England's mental health episodes are among the most thoroughly documented cases of royal neurological illness, with extensive records kept by court physicians, government officials, and contemporary observers. Modern medical historians, analysing surviving records, believe George III suffered from porphyria, a genetic condition affecting the nervous system. However, we must note that this represents a modern interpretation of historical symptoms rather than a definitive historical diagnosis. The treatments provided to George III are documented in court medical records, showing approaches that reflected emerging 18th century understanding of mental illness as a medical rather than purely spiritual condition. Dr. Francis Willis's treatment methods are recorded in detail, providing insight into early psychiatric care. The constitutional implications of George III's condition are extensively documented in parliamentary records, showing how medical assessments influence questions of royal capacity and governmental authority during periods when the king could not perform his duties. Historical records consistently show how royal illness became a matter of public and political concern, with extensive documentation of how medical conditions affected governance, succession planning, and international relations. Court physicians found themselves documenting not only medical conditions, but also their political implications, creating records that reveal the intersection between medicine and statecraft. These documents show how royal health information was managed, controlled, and sometimes manipulated for political purposes. The requirement for royal patients to maintain public duties despite illness is documented across multiple courts and time periods, showing the unique pressures faced by monarchs who could not retreat from public life during medical crises. While we have extensive records of royal medical treatments and conditions, historians must acknowledge the limitations of interpreting these sources centuries later. Contemporary medical understanding was fundamentally different from modern medicine, making it impossible to apply current diagnostic criteria to historical cases with complete certainty. What these records do provide is clear evidence of the dedication shown by both royal patients and their physicians in facing medical challenges that the limitations of their era made extremely difficult to overcome. The courage demonstrated by individuals dealing with chronic illness while maintaining public responsibilities deserves recognition, regardless of our ability to diagnose their conditions by modern standards precisely. The next chapter examines a more troubling aspect of royal medical history, documented cases where the line between healing and harming became deliberately blurred. We'll explore verified instances of poison suspicions in royal courts, the documented paranoia that surrounded royal medical care, and historical cases where political assassination may have been disguised as medical treatment. These darker chapters of royal medical history reveal how the trust essential to effective medical care could be corrupted by political intrigue, creating situations where royal patients faced not only the challenges of illness, but also legitimate fears about the intentions of those treating them. The fear of poisoning haunted European royal courts for centuries, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that fundamentally changed how monarchs approached medical treatment. While many suspected poisoning cases remain unproven, the documented paranoia surrounding royal medicine reveals how political intrigue corrupted the trust essential to effective medical care. This chapter examines verified cases of poison suspicions, documented security measures taken by fearful courts, and the historical evidence, both strong and circumstantial, for medical assassination attempts that may have succeeded in eliminating political rivals through corrupted medical care. The Medici family of Florence acquired a reputation for sophisticated poisoning techniques that spread throughout European courts, though separating historical fact from legend requires careful analysis of surviving records. What is historically verified is that the Medici were suspected of using poison as a political tool, and this reputation influenced how other courts viewed Italian physicians. Catherine de' Medici's arrival in France as queen consort brought Italian medical practices and Italian suspicions to the French court. Contemporary accounts, including diplomatic correspondence preserved in various European archives, document the fear that surrounded Italian physicians and their methods. Historical records show that several French nobles who opposed Catherine's policies died under circumstances that contemporary observers found suspicious. However, we must be clear that while these deaths raised suspicions at the time, definitive proof of poisoning is lacking in most cases. What is documented is the climate of fear that developed around Italian medical practices. The challenge for historians is that much of what we know about Medici poisoning comes from rumours, political propaganda, and later sensationalized accounts rather than verifiable contemporary evidence. What is certain is that the reputation for medical assassination became a political weapon in itself, whether or not the underlying accusations were accurate. The Borgia papacy of Alexander VI and his son Cesare provides another case where historical reputation may exceed verifiable evidence. While numerous contemporary accounts accuse the Borgias of systematic poisoning, modern historians note that much of this documentation comes from their political enemies. Vatican records from this period, analysed by historians like Michael Mallet, show that accusations of Borgia poisoning were widespread among contemporary observers. However, distinguishing between political propaganda and factual reporting remains challenging when examining 15th century sources. What is historically documented is that several cardinals and nobles who opposed Borgia's policies died suddenly during Alexander VI's papacy. Contemporary accounts, including letters from ambassadors and church officials, record suspicions about these deaths. However, modern historians caution that sudden death was common in Renaissance Italy due to various diseases, making definitive conclusions about poisoning difficult to reach. The reputation for papal poisoning became so established that it influenced European politics for decades, regardless of whether specific cases could be proven. This demonstrates how suspicion alone could serve political purposes. The Tudor succession created documented cases where political rivals faced suspicious deaths that contemporary observers attributed to poisoning, though definitive proof remains elusive in most instances. The death of Arthur, Prince of Wales, in 1502 sparked immediate rumours about poisoning, preserved in contemporary diplomatic correspondence. However, modern historians examining the available evidence note that Arthur's symptoms were consistent with epidemic diseases common in early 16th century England. What makes this case historically significant is not whether poisoning actually occurred, but how quickly suspicions arose and how they influenced political behaviour. Court records show that security around royal medical care was immediately increased following Arthur's death, suggesting that contemporary observers took poisoning fears seriously regardless of the actual cause. Lady Jane Grey's death in 1554 provides another case where historians must carefully distinguish between documented facts and later speculation. While some accounts suggest she may have been poisoned before her execution, contemporary records indicate she was executed by beheading as ordered by Mary Tudor. The pattern we see repeatedly is that whenever politically convenient deaths occurred, poisoning accusations would follow, but proving these accusations centuries later remains extremely difficult given the medical knowledge and documentation practices of the period. The French royal court during the religious wars created an environment where poisoning fears reached paranoid levels, with extensive documentation of security measures and suspicious deaths. The death of Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, in 1572, provides one of the better documented cases of suspected royal poisoning. Contemporary accounts, including letters from the Venetian ambassador and court observers, describe her sudden illness and rapid death just weeks before her son's politically significant wedding. Several contemporary sources preserved in French royal archives describe Jeanne d'Albret's symptoms as suspicious and unlike a natural illness. However, modern historians note that these accounts were written by political observers rather than medical professionals, limiting their diagnostic value. What is historically certain is that Jeanne d'Albret's death occurred at a politically convenient time for Catholic factions, and that contemporary observers immediately suspected poisoning. Whether their suspicions were justified remains an open historical question. The paranoia following high-profile suspicious deaths led to documented changes in French royal medical protocols. Court records show the implementation of food tasters, multiple physician oversight, and enhanced security around medical treatments, measures that suggest contemporary fears were taken seriously at the highest levels. The extensive Habsburg territories created complex political situations where family members sometimes found themselves on opposing sides, leading to documented suspicions about medical assassination within the royal family itself. The death of Don Carlos, son of Philip II of Spain, in 1568 sparked immediate speculation about poisoning that continues among historians today. Contemporary accounts describe Don Carlos as mentally unstable and politically dangerous, creating motives for elimination that some historians find compelling. However, modern analysis of surviving medical records, conducted by historians like Geoffrey Parker, suggests Don Carlos may have died from natural causes related to his documented mental and physical health problems. The challenge is that contemporary medical understanding was insufficient to distinguish between natural death and sophisticated poisoning. What is historically documented is that Don Carlos's death was politically convenient for Spanish stability, and that contemporary observers suspected foul play. Whether these suspicions were justified cannot be definitively determined from surviving evidence. The Habsburg response to these suspicions is documented in court records showing enhanced medical security protocols and increased surveillance of court physicians, suggesting that royal authorities took poisoning fears seriously regardless of their basis in fact. The prevalence of poisoning fears led to the development of sophisticated detection methods that are well documented in court records and medical texts of the period. Italian courts developed systematic testing protocols that included animal trials for royal medications, as documented in surviving medical treatises. These methods, while primitive by modern standards, represented serious attempts to address legitimate security concerns. The famous poison rings and unicorn horns used by royalty for poison detection are documented in royal inventories and contemporary accounts. While we now know these items had no real protective value, their widespread use demonstrates the extent of royal paranoia about poisoning. Court records from multiple European kingdoms show the implementation of elaborate food tasting protocols, with detailed documentation of who tested what and when. These measures created enormous logistical challenges, but were deemed necessary given contemporary fears. From a historical perspective, poison represented an attractive assassination method because it combined several advantages that other approaches lacked, though proving specific cases remains challenging. Medical knowledge of the period included an understanding of various toxic substances that could mimic natural diseases. Surviving medical texts document physicians' knowledge of substances that could cause symptoms resembling common illnesses like fever, digestive problems, or respiratory distress. The social position of physicians provided them with legitimate access to their targets and professional credibility that made accusations difficult to sustain. Court records show that physicians were rarely prosecuted for patient deaths, as medical failure was expected given the limitations of period medicine. However, historians must emphasize that possessing the means and opportunity for medical assassination does not prove it actually occurred in specific cases. The challenge is distinguishing between what was possible and what actually happened, given the limited and often biased nature of historical sources. The long-term consequences of poisoning fears are well documented in how royal courts evolved their medical practices and security protocols over several centuries. Court records show how poisoning paranoia led to delays in medical treatment, as elaborate testing and verification procedures were implemented. Some historians suggest this medical paranoia may have contributed to preventable royal deaths by impeding necessary care. The international reputation of certain courts for poisoning expertise affected diplomatic relations in documented ways. Ambassadors' reports describe reluctance to accept hospitality from rulers suspected of using poison, and marriage negotiations sometimes included specific concerns about medical safety. The profession of medicine itself was transformed by its association with potential assassination, as documented in medical texts and court records that show enhanced scrutiny of physicians and reduced autonomy in treating royal patients. Modern historians face significant challenges in assessing historical poisoning claims, as the evidence required for definitive conclusions is rarely available in cases from centuries past. Contemporary accounts were often written by political observers with their own biases and agendas, making them unreliable for medical assessment. Political enemies had clear motives for spreading poisoning accusations, while supporters had reasons to suppress such claims. The medical knowledge of the period was insufficient to distinguish reliably between natural death and sophisticated poisoning, meaning that even well-intentioned contemporary observers could not provide accurate medical assessments. Modern forensic techniques cannot be applied to most historical cases due to the lack of preserved physical evidence, leaving historians to work with incomplete and potentially biased documentary sources. Throughout this examination, we must distinguish between cases with substantial contemporary documentation and those that exist primarily in later legend and speculation. Some cases, like the suspicious deaths that occurred during periods of political crisis, have contemporary documentation of the suspicions they raised, even if we cannot prove the underlying accusations. Other famous poisoning cases turn out to rely heavily on later historical speculation rather than contemporary evidence, requiring careful analysis to separate historical fact from dramatic embellishment. The pattern that emerges is that while specific poisoning cases often cannot be definitively proven, the fear of medical assassination was very real and had significant documented effects on how royal courts operated. Perhaps the most documented aspect of royal poisoning fears is how they affected the people caught up in them. Both the royal patients who lived in constant fear and the physicians who found themselves under suspicion regardless of their intentions. Court records describe royal patients refusing needed medical treatment due to poisoning fears, and physicians struggling to provide care under conditions of extreme suspicion and surveillance. The psychological burden of living under constant threat of assassination through medicine is documented in letters and memoirs from various courts, showing how fear corrupted the basic human relationships necessary for effective medical care. These human costs were real and documented, regardless of whether specific poisoning accusations were justified. The fear itself became a destructive force that harmed both patient care and the physician-patient relationship essential to healing. Looking back at this complex historical territory, we see how the intersection of medicine and political power created situations where trust, the foundation of all medical care, became a luxury that royal patients and their physicians could rarely afford. The documentation shows us not necessarily a world full of medical assassins, but certainly a world where the fear of them shaped how royal medicine was practiced for centuries. Whether or not specific poisoning cases can be proven, the documented impact of these fears on royal medical care represents a tragic chapter in the history of medicine, where political intrigue corrupted the healing relationship that should have been based on trust, compassion, and dedication to patient welfare. Thank you for sticking around and watching this story unfold. I really appreciate your time and curiosity. History can be messy, strange, and uncomfortable, but it helps us understand the world a little better. I hope you found this journey as fascinating as I did. Until next time, take care and stay curious.